Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. The motion for today's debate is, this House prefers a world where truth and reconciliation commissions were established to deal with the aftermath of the Yugoslav wars rather than the ICTY. Representing the proposition, we have the team from Bulgaria, and on the opposition, we have the team from Philippines. From the proposition side, our speakers are first speaker Kaloyan, second speaker Valentin, third speaker Tanya, reply speaker Valentin. On the opposition side, our speakers are first speaker Kim, second speaker Mika, third speaker Andrei, reply speaker Mika. Each speaker will have 8 minutes to deliver their speech. The first and last minute of each speech is considered protected time, during which points of information may not be offered. The judges will signal the end of protected time at the 1 minute mark, after which points of information can be offered, and will signal the return to protected time at the 7 minute mark. At the 8 minute mark, they will give a double clap or ding to signal the end of the speech. Additionally, there will be 3 claps or dings at 8:15, and the judges will stop listening at 8:30. Best of luck to both teams. I now hand over the floor to our chair judge.
All right, thank you very much, and sorry for the overlap in terms of introductions. I'm sure that makes everything clear. One thing I just want to mention that this is going to be live streamed, so just be cognizant of that when it comes to everything. And with that, I'd like to reiterate good luck to everyone, and may this be a wonderful debate. Without further ado, first proposition to open the debate. Yeah, we have the bell. And then be back.
Hate, pain, suffering. This is the status quo in former Yugoslavia. The war ended 25 years ago, but still people feel the fear of violence on day-to-day basis due to the ICTY's unjust decisions. Vote against them, propose. What you're going to hear in this speech, flagging of our team line. Firstly, what are the deltas in the debate, aka the differences between the two institutions? Then the justice clash, one argument on why the TCR delivers justice better. Then on the tensions clash, we have 2 arguments. The first on why the TRCs are more effective in tension diffusion, and in the second speech on why the ICTY actively rose ethnic tensions in the region. So, frame, what is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and what is the delta between the two? There are 2 main ones. The first one is who runs this thing. The TRC are run by independent organs, such as the church, but not necessarily. Like in Desmond's Tuto in the South Africa, where they're the most effective. This is the most effective example. Therefore, they're unbiased and local, aka in Serbian, for example, etc. But ICTYs are run by the UN. Therefore, they're heavily based in the West. They're in The Hague, they're in English, they have Western judges. Therefore, they are heavily biased towards the West, but not accessible to, because they're not local, their people can't attend, but also they're not in the local language. The second delta is the amnesty thing. TCRs provide amnesty, as per the South African example, but it happens only if 3 criteria are met. The first one is sufficient amount of information, aka who actually you killed, when, with whom you worked with, where you buried the bodies, etc. But secondly, it has to be true because it is provable. At the end of the day, I can see whether you actually buried the bodies there, but also I can see whether the stories overlap between the testimonies, right? And if someone isn't overlapping, therefore he is lying. But finally, he has to apologize because this is the reconciliation part. If these criteria are not met, / the person refuses to participate in this thing, means that he will face trial since he has no amnesty. Pretty intuitive. On the comparative, we have a trial directly, and it is perfectly, it has a longer thing with a huge burden of proof. Moving on to argumentation. Why the TCRs are comparatively better at delivering justice than the ICTY, which has proved to be extremely ineffective to do so. 2 mechanisms here. The first one is not enough convicted criminals on their side of the house. Why is this the case? Because the court needs huge amounts of evidence to start prosecuting, let alone convict someone. There is a huge burden of proof. A person is going to jail, maybe for life even. Therefore, many war criminals have gotten away because the prosecutors didn't have enough evidence to even start prosecuting them, let alone convict them, dear panel. What does this mean? There is a second reason. But even if they are convicted, many people appealed and therefore they got pardoned afterwards. For example, Vojislav Šešelj, who basically got away after like only 10 years in prison, even though he was sentenced for life. What is the result? We have only 161 convicted when 60,000 people have been slaughtered in genocide during this war, dear panel. This is an absurdly low number, and there is a huge amount of criminals walking today in the streets of Serbia, maybe even. But the thing is that on our side this doesn't happen because we have not nearly as much a burden of proof. Because I don't know, the thing is that we only need to have implicit evidence or simply hearsay or I don't know. Simply a suspicion of someone to be summoned to these commissions. Therefore, it is a lot more likely for a lot more cases to be went through because that's how we actually have a lot more people's cases went through in our side of the house. The second mechanism is that people didn't admit the truth on their side. Why is this the case? Because there is no active incentive to do so, because the more you admit, the lower the sentence you get. I wouldn't admit that I have done 3 genocides if I'm only prosecuted for 1. The intuition pump is simple. If I know that I'll burn myself if I put my hand in boiling water, I wouldn't do it. Pretty intuitive. Therefore, the bottom line is that I wouldn't admit the other 2 genocides. On the comparative, I would, because I fear the court. Slobodan drink poison on national television. Milosevic hanged himself before trial. This is actually true. Therefore, since this is a necessity as per our model, they will say it all in order to save their skin. The bottom line is that and we have a lot of information and only true information. Why is this so important? 2 things here. Firstly, we get to understand the truth which is principally correct. That is why we give lower sentences to people who have admitted that they are guilty. That is why our society values truth so much. But on the practical level, victims feel deeper sense of closure for 2 reasons. The first one is that we have information on where your kid is buried and gives you a unique sense of closure because you can have your final moment with your kid by burying it yourself. But second, to see the war criminal go through the humiliating for him process of admitting gives you this sense of closure that he is villainized now. Because on the comparative, he is simply walking away as a hero even though he goes to a cell. Moving on to second argumentation, but before that, go.
Will the PRC claim an individual party is guilty or will they represent different perspectives from different ethnicities?
That makes no sense because understand that we have to hear. Again, this is about making people tell the truth. There is no conviction, there is no such biases that are affecting anything important. Moving on. PRCs are an effective radicalization diffusers. Why? There are 2 burdens in this argument. The first one is that we have forgiveness and understanding. On forgiveness, why this exists? Because it allows for a symbolic forgiveness process. The TRC allows victims to face their oppressors, talk with them, but most crucially, hear the word sorry for them. This is extremely important. But second, this wouldn't happen on the comparative because there is no incentive to say sorry as they will plead guilty in their efforts to escape the prison. The second reason on basically understanding. The criminals can explain their thoughts, basically that they have feared their death, or for example that they have been radicalized to the extent of propaganda, to the extent that they weren't thinking what they did. The thing is that people now understand their point of view, therefore they are not in their bubble and don't hate that much. Because at the end of the day, when you have understanding, you know you can do much more and actually the tension diffuses from there. But why is this actually decreasing? Firstly, we have forgiveness, which is the first step towards moving on, and therefore you face what happened afterwards, and therefore you simply, you're not vindictive in this way. But even if not forgiveness, there is understanding, therefore there is closure, therefore there is coping in the whole thing. But even if that's not the case, the criminals are humiliated, which gives a huge sense of closure because they're already villainized to the maximum. Therefore, things in the future, such as 2023 Republika Srpska organized hate crimes involving, harassment and violence towards Croats, wouldn't have happened because the tensions would have gotten down. We're talking about people not being harassed, we're talking about people not being hate crime, which is, I believe, pretty intuitively bad. The thing is, dear panel, that obviously it is about preference at the end of the day. Whether you prefer to live in a world where people suffer, where people are extremely vulnerable to everyday violence, like in, I don't know, Kosovo, or I don't know, the whole region in that essence, or you prefer to live in a world which actually stands for truth, reconciliation, and peace. Please propose.
If I saw my mother forcefully pulled from my fingertips and beaten to death in front of me, a piece of paper and apology is not enough. I too would call for justice, if not blood. And blood would spill if I did not have a court backing me up. Truth does not matter if action does not support it. 4 rebuttals before my substantive. First, they tell us that the reason why the ICTY shouldn't be supported is because of the low conviction rate. I do not understand this. Notice that on our side, at least we have a conviction rate. On their side, they just get to run away scot-free with just telling a simple story. On our side, at the very least, we attempt for justice. At the very least, we try to seek out for punitive measures for the thousands of people who died, who didn't need to die, but then ended up dead anyways. Second thing on how these tell us that they're going to get all this information. This is a symmetric benefit because recognize that before a court proceeding could even happen in the first place, information has to be gathered and it has to be lengthy. So I don't understand why this information is only likely to happen on their side. But then thirdly, on how they mischaracterize TRC. It's not an independent body. The whole nature of a TRC is that it's internal. These states are going to manage them themselves. So if they problematize bias, they're also going to have to mechanize to us why exactly this bias isn't going to exist. Even if these are NGOs and even if these are members of the church, why exactly are they not going to be biased towards the state that they origin from? Right? But then last rebuttal, they give us no cap on what villainization looks like. They tell us that this is a mechanism on their side wherein these individuals are probably going to be villainized. But if these individuals are going to be villainized anyway, if it's going to work on their side where they're going to be shunned out of society, then they might as well be jailed. What's the point of being out and about if the entire world is against you, right? But then secondly, even if they're not going to be villainized to that extent, then there's nothing possibly pushing them away from retaining their ill-gotten wealth, from getting back into positions of government, from getting back into positions where they can cost even more lives. They needed to prove this in order to win. First point of clarification on what exactly the limitations of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee is. First, it's how it relied on voluntary participation, right? Recognize that they provide us mechanisms like amnesty and say that this is enough and sufficient of an incentive, but this wasn't enough, right? Because one, victims were firstly afraid of prosecution and persecution, right? They were afraid that other people would come against them and they would be attacked, especially in such a polarized era. But then secondly, on how the witness protection program was very limited under the TRC because of its inherent nature of being publicized, right? But then thirdly, on perpetrators likely not wanting to create more political enemies or concessions that would have given them a much more difficult chance to get into these positions of power, right? But then lastly, that we also have to note that you cannot really subpoena these individuals under the TRC anyways. You cannot force them to talk. You cannot force the truth out of them. What they could possibly do is create some convoluted lie or create some convoluted piece of information which they are more than likely able to do, seeing as they are in these positions of power in the first place. But second limitation, on how they prioritize forgiveness over justice. Recognize that this never is going to happen, especially during the Yugoslav wars where everyone was against each other. More on this in my second speaker, right? But then additionally, what happens here is you neglect the bitter feelings of the people on the ground, the feeling of wanting your mother's death to finally be avenged, right? The impact of this is twofold. First, accountability for war crimes were unsatisfactory. Abusers simply just get to walk free for telling a story, right? But then secondly, there's a lacking deterrence for future war crimes, which I already proved to you why it's so important. They have to prove that on our side. But then third lacking thing from the TRC on how there's no guarantee of
of push-through with recommendations made by the TRC. A lacking piece of characterization coming from government is how the TRC only provides recommendations. They do not provide bounding check and balances or new forms of accountability. All they provide are suggestions. This is why in South Africa, they had a difficult time rebuilding after the end of the apartheid because they didn't come up with solutions that were properly accounted for. They came up with idealistic solutions, and the new government had a very easy chance and decision to just disregard them. But then comparatively, the ICTY was created by the UN to set a precedent that regardless of which side of the conflict you are on, any and all breaches of human rights would never go unpunished. This looked like convicting criminals based on the magnitude and the action of their involvement. This looks like involving judicial mechanisms that already existed and were successful. Third, it looks like a clear establishment of facts so that the accused had the opportunity for due process. Two impacts to this. First, this instilled a deep fear of being convicted or pulled out in officials, especially since the ICTY lasted years and lasted for a very long time. Second, this gives victims the ability to feel like justice is being served, like they weren't just on the sideline watching these individuals walk free after they murdered their entire family. But then even if these individuals were not convicted, it's better than just having to be forced to sit down and watch as their entire family goes by unrecognized, right? This is significant as well because this prevents individuals from having to seek vengeance for themselves and having to seek bloodshed to accommodate their own feelings of resentment, right? More on that later. First argument on why the ICTY was crucial in preventing further conflict. This is true because one, of the quality of research and fact-fighting. Government concedes that on the ICTY, you destroy an entire life by sending them to prison. We think that this is the exact incentive why the ICTY had to be so thorough because they were going to send someone to prison and ruin their entire life, their reputation, and their dignity, right? But at the same time, we think that the ICTY also had an incentive because any incorrect ruling and sentence with lacking logical reasoning would have likely led to an insurgence of toxic nationalism, which was already prevalent at the time. This meant that the ICTY had a more rigorous judicial process, but also that any decision made by the court was harder to question. This is true because the court had multiple levels to it. It's harder to question, it's harder to appeal. There's a due process to this, right? The repercussions as well for publishing an incorrect or lacking report is so significantly less than charging an individual. The second layer to this is that victims did not have to avenge themselves. So under the TRC, all you get is a list and a front row view of your abuser walking away scot-free. You get no catharsis, so you likely have harder time moving on because you weren't even given the chance to try in the first place. This leads to things like microaggressions, movements, or violent acts, things that I mentioned earlier. On opposition, you get this form of catharsis because at the very least, you are able to be part of the process. At the very least, you are able to feel satiated in the fact that you tried. But then second layer to this argument is how this individualized guilt and responsibility. Recognize that without the ICTY, the likely prevalent belief is that this region or this race is probably a bunch of war criminals. This area is like a bunch of hate crimes, right? This raises tensions and this raises a lot of conflict within these individuals. But at the very least in status quo, there is some form of recognition that crimes were done by both sides because they were able to meticulously persecute each criminal or each political abuser, right? But then even if status quo has some level of prejudice, the TRC probably would have made it worse because they would have made their own conclusions from that long list of information anyways. But then last point on why the ICTY was necessary in rebuilding the post-conflict states. First, on how the ICTY provided a comprehensive legal framework. The international community learned from the ICTY. They use this in other applications as well. But in individual states, it helped dismantle previous structures of impunity, which was used as the foundation of law for these states, right? This also looked like the comprehensive system of the ICTY, at least being able to minimize feelings of pain and anger because of due process. But then secondly, how this allowed past conflict states to have a form of stability. You get a sense of justice, you get a sense that you actually tried, and we think that's so much better when you vote for opposition. Thank you.
This afternoon, I'd like to invite the second proposition to take the stage and continue their case here.
Могли нещо по-точно. Okay, starting this speech and starting this speech on my next word. Do you call a rigorous court that assesses every evidence a court that has like 40% of appeals and pardons in it? I believe not. I believe this is not the reality we live in. I believe that they simply live in this magical world where the ICTY was done perfectly and it was all sunshine and rainbows. This is clearly not what happened. These people suffered. These people were convicted. These people were not convicted, as my first speaker says. Like, do you imagine 160 people killing so many civilians? This is simply impossible. A lot of people got away. A lot of people were left unjustly. Now, what we're going to hear in this speech, firstly on how victims feel, then on deterrence, and then on why ethnic tensions are much worse on their side of the house. Now, firstly, let's begin with how victims feel. Notice how the whole argument about justice and all these things, that this is the way we punish people and all that, is completely dependent on this being an effective court. Also, victims, this completely depends on it being an effective court. If somebody has killed my child, my mother, I want him to be sentenced, maybe, but he won't be sentenced on their side of the house. Right. So, if I explain why the ICTY is inefficient in doing all of these, reasons came in my first speech, I'll provide extra reasons, then these arguments don't stay in the debate. But then, let's take them at their best and say, okay, why victims won't actually do this? There are two main reasons for this. Firstly, notice how they will always feel like the verdict is too light. Why? Because they have killed your child, you will never see it again. You feel like this person deserves death, like this person should not be on this world or should get at least a higher sentence. Having in mind that these people were sentenced to 20 years, 30 years, you believe this is not worth for a whole life. It simply seems unproportional to you, especially when you're so emotional in this sort of particular case. What is the comparative though? If never, on our side, you know that this is all you can get in this sort of way. You know that the apology, the truth and reconciliation part is all you can get. You can't get anything else. While on their side, you see other victims getting more. You see them getting more years for the same crime. While on our side, you have to be satisfied because you got what you could have gotten. Right. This is the comparative. The second thing I want to say is imagine how bad it will feel if they got pardoned after 5 years after they're sent into prison. Right. This will feel incredibly horrible. The whole of the judge system does not respect the death of your children. This is how it will feel. The bottom line is these people suffer greatly and it is not worth for the marginal impact on punishment that's being done once for the people who got pardoned and the victims that suffered by that. Right. Then, what else do they tell us let's then continue with deterrence. Before that, yeah, sure, go.
You problematize not having enough convictions, but how do you get that on your end when the TRC lacks judicial jurisdiction to convict someone?
We explain other ways people can get closure and victims can feel good. This is not the only way to punish somebody. There are so many other ways. My first speaker outlines them, I won't repeat them. Okay, great. Then, let's continue to the deterrence point. They say, this is likely to deter other people from doing these sort of particular things. We believe that for you to do war crimes, you need to have significant reasons to do these sort of war crimes, to be ordered to do them, or for you to truly hate this nation. When emotions are at play, you most probably won't consider, or when you are about to die, you most probably won't consider the implication of the ICTY suing me after 5 years or 27 years, which was the reality, by the way. You most probably wouldn't consider that when you're doing war crimes. War crimes is something that happens emotional when you particularly hate a certain ethnicity and all these sort of things. You most probably wouldn't think, I'm going to get sued after 27 years. You are not rational while doing this. This is ridiculous. Right. What else do they tell us? They tell us these people simply would not say that they have done this, and this is very bad. Like, please notice that if they don't say that they have done this, this will most probably lead to them. Okay, great, I will go notice. This will most probably lead to them. This will lead to this sort of. First, they will say this. Why will they say this? Because they fear the court. If we know that these people got pardoned. We know that these people didn't get that much of a sentence. They didn't know this, right? At the point which they didn't know this, they're likely to go for telling the truth and receiving an amnesty and risk going to jail. They don't know how effective this court is, we know it, this is the doubt here. But secondly, the debate is symmetrical if we're talking about the people who won't tell, because then they will go to the ICTY, right? So we're talking only about the people who will tell this sort of particular thing. Great. Then let's continue with let's continue with the other argument. The other argument is basically on the ICTY, how it rose ethnic tensions. There are a few things I want to say here. No, there was the bias idea. Okay, they say, the church will be very biased. Like, please notice, we say that this will be done by unbiased institutions, right? But also there is a high incentive for this thing to happen because you want to show some sort of legitimacy to the victims. When it's done by an unbiased institution, this is something that will happen. But when it's done by, for example, the government or somebody who is biased, then this will not happen. They will not feel satisfied. They're likely to protest. No government wants this. This leads to destabilization. This leads to all these sort of things. But also, the church specifically as an actor is really good because it has moral consideration at hand. They want to do the good thing because they believe they will go to hell if they don't do the good thing. This is why the church specifically is the good actor to do this. Right. Okay, now let's continue to the argument of how ICTY rose ethnic tensions. Now, please notice, there are three mechanizations here. Firstly, the ICTY is perceived as illegitimate in the countries it operated. Firstly, notice how there was disproportionate sentencing of Serbs. 91 Serbs were sentenced, 44 Croats were sentenced, and 0 Kosovo people were sentenced to life. Right. At the point where this is the case, we believe that firstly, Serbs were very happy because they see, proportionately, it doesn't make sense. They should have gotten sentenced as much as us. But Croats are also not happy because Croats thought, no, they started the war, so we shouldn't have any people sentenced. So both sides are unhappy and both sides think the court is illegitimate. The second reason, judges work from countries part of the NATO, and notice that these countries don't like NATO because NATO bombed them in the past in this sort of particular way. So they don't like the judges from this country, so they don't like the verdict that these judges do. Thirdly, this gives platform to be scandalous to the war criminals. Notice they're likely to campaign in their support of their countries. This looks like Vojislav Šešelj, who used, no, I won't take the wise anymore. You used to use testimony to discredit the court, saying the court was rigged. With us, this changes because they have to apologize, they have to admit their guilt, so they can't discredit the court in this sort of particular way. Right, as my first speaker explained, these people are war heroes, you will believe these people, right? But secondly, the decisions did not lead to an effective decision because it led to a lot of appeals and releases. Notice, the burden of proof for crime against humanity is incredibly high, and it was lacking due to, firstly, them refusing to talk because when they talk, they will get a higher sentence because they have to plead guilty to more things. But secondly, they had to prove that the head officer controlled subordinates, which is something incredibly hard and pretty much impossible when recordings were not a thing. Right. But even if they were sued, the cases are revised as the new technology emerges, and many of them were released, particularly 60 out of the 161 people done. Notice, this means that the decisions seem even more uncertain and illegitimate to the average person. Right. Then what is the bottom line of this? People on both sides perceive the court as illegitimate, which led to rising of this sort of particular tensions. And they turn to things like violence in this sort of particular way because you feel like you have to avenge your country. You feel like you were robbed. You feel like this great person was taken from you, so you have to revenge the ethnicity that has done this to you in this sort of particular way. This means that more violence is likely to happen on their side of the house, with the ICTY actively making things even worse. Vote for us.
Second proposition for the voting remarks. Continuing the debate, moving on. Next speaker, second.
Is everyone ready? Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1, go.
If you knew how your family member was brutally killed and you knew who murdered them, you would be cursing the world, cursing the person who stripped them of their humanity and took everything worth living for away from you. You would want reparations. You would never forgive the person who did this to you. The speech will go as follows. Firstly, a few extraneous rebuttals, then I'll explain two things. One, why the TRC lacked the capacity to be effective, but secondly, why the judicial process of the ICTY was far better for healing as opposed to propositions counterfactual. Firstly, on a few rebuttals then. One, they claim that the truth is important. We never refuted this. We agreed with them, but we told you it happens or information happens on either side of the house. When you start a literal court case, obviously you would need evidence, you would need to investigate. You get that at the start of the case. Kim already explained why this is better because of due process. She also explained that the truth is useless if you do nothing with it. But secondly, they say that their alternative is not justice, it's simply just the truth, and somehow people are going to be forgiving of the person that murdered their family member. There's a glaring contradiction here, because if it is true, using their own premise, that in status quo everyone was not happy due to the fact that not everyone got convicted, I'm pretty sure that victims on the ground would be more upset and angry and would have more hatred if they didn't even get a chance at a hearing or they didn't get a chance at the court case. I would never forgive someone who took away my mother from my arms, and especially if I knew their identity and who they were. I probably would want reparations then. Two lines of argumentation. Firstly, why the TRC will never have the capacity to create cohesive narratives. This is the premise that they miss on their end. The premise of this argument is simple, that nationalistic echo chambers were established far before the war started. They already hated each other before the wars, and this led to a lot of misinformation and states villainizing each other. We needed a body to counteract this denial culture and historical revisionism beyond reasonable doubt. On their end, they still have doubt. Why would the TRC then not be effective? For three main reasons. Firstly, political oppositions can prevent TRC movements from occurring in the first place. And this is worse because with the Yugoslav wars, these were 6 states that were pitted against each other. 6 states that had their own truth and had their own narrative and wanted to run from accountability. Take, for example, in Kosovo, they did try to create a TRC, but they failed due to opposition by Albanian nationalists. But let's say that even if you're able to create this TRC and establish it, you as these 6 states are probably going to give them little authority. We saw this in Liberia with the civil war when they wanted to investigate the president. They banned them from investigating other groups. And because of the weight of the Yugoslav wars and the fact that all of them committed some sort of war crimes, they're probably going to do this as well. This means that these 6 states who hate each other will have no guarantee that they're going to work together in a collective manner. You get no truth on their end. You just get these competing narratives. The comparative is very simple. At the very least, the ICTY has judicial jurisdiction over all of these territories. So these territories cannot withhold information or else they are going to be tried as well. They're going to be tried as well. But secondly, you have to realize on their end, there's more fear in speaking out. Like, for example, one, perpetrators are going to be scared to be subject to the torture by their higher officials. So they're probably not going to out their own officials anyways, especially due to nationalistic sentiment. But even so, even if they want to speak out and convict their own higher officials, there's probably going to be minimal information and it's going to be insufficient then on their end. At the very least, again, there's judicial jurisdiction that makes you need, like, that forces you to have to tell the truth anyways. But secondly, on the victims themselves, on their end, they have to relive the trauma. And yeah, on either side of the bench, they have to speak out, but on their end, you get no reparations. It is not going to be worth it. On their end as well, secondly, is that their narratives can be questioned. You have to realize there's a strong denial culture. Truth can be manipulated, especially by political elites. And if their comparative is that everyone gets to speak out, when you have these competing narratives, everyone can tell a different story. They do not guarantee why it's going to be cohesive in the first place. The comparative then is very clear on 3 layers. One, on our end, not necessarily everyone has to speak out and be put in court, but those who feel a strong sense of emotion are the ones who are going to feel the most betrayed if the ICTY never existed, are going to speak out. And we believe that secondly, this is going to feel more empowering because you're able to be part of the process. You're able, even if you're unable to convict, at the very least you're able to speak out and do something, and that in itself is good enough for you as a victim. But lastly, is that you have support from the international community, and this links to Kim's framing on where this is done by the UN, right? The TRC, again, is an intergovernmental organization, which means these states are going to be doing it themselves. They do not have the capacity to have good investigations because they are literally post-conflict. They do not have enough resources to have these investigations in the first place. At the very least, in the ICTY under the UN 1, you have funding for investigations because it's not only these states funding themselves, but other external bodies as well, like the West or NATO. But secondly, it is large scale. You get large scale attention because now this is an international thing. It's not just between states, it is between everyone involved, right? But in addition to that, not only do you get third-party objectivity, but again, you get the attention that you need, especially as these victims. Before I proceed, go PY.
Understand that you have to prove why you have the capacity to make people retributed. You have only 161 cases. There are a lot of people who don't have justice on your side too.
161 cases is better than 0 on their end, obviously. But lastly, let's assume they can get the information. One, it is delegitimized because there's no judicial repercussions. You can easily just say that this person's accounts are wrong. We saw this, for example, with the Ecuador TRC when they investigated the dictatorial regime and the military generals just said that these victims are wrong and manipulated the information. This is what's going to happen with the if you establish a TRC with Yugoslavia. But lastly, there's no guarantee that these people are going to incarcerate themselves again. Like, they're probably just going to invalidate victims. These victims cannot fight back because they do not have a court on their end. The comparative then is very clear. We do not deny these crimes that have been committed, and we do not praise the criminals who did these crimes in the first place. We are able to establish a more factual understanding of what happened because this is literally the judicial court. You cannot question it. You cannot question it. The truth doesn't matter if there's no action to support it then. But lastly, on the process of catharsis and why justice was better for it, on 3 main metrics. 1, the TRC was hollow and it made you feel powerless because, yeah, you spoke up, but what comes after that? You just have to simply suck up your emotions and forgive the person who killed your family member. No one is ever going to do that. The ICTY at the very least was effective at convicting, for example, the big names like the president of Serbia or the president of the Bosnian Serbs. Even if they were on the run for decades, they still got convicted. We cannot convict everyone, but we convict them important people. But secondly, is that if you cannot get institutional reparations, you are going to go for informal justice. Kim already explained why this looks like microaggressions, and this is worsened on their end when you cannot individualize guilt, when you're just going to release reports on who exactly killed your family members, and you get no reparations. I don't care how long these reparations take. At the very least, at the end of the day, you got it in the first place. But lastly, if you're unsatisfied with the ICTY, you're probably going to be more unsatisfied with the TRC because you have the same, on the best case, there's the same information, there's the same experiences, but the dichotomy here is that the TRC had no action, had no judicial investigation. These people deserve prison, but on propositions, and they will never get time. For all these reasons and more, Philippines.
Right, we thank the second opposition speaker for those great remarks. Now, as a final substantive from Team Prop, the proposition to take the stage.
Starting with my first word.
Bulgaria is our home, the Balkans are our home. Rise of tensions in this area are something important that the other side fails to engage with. How does this look like? Imagine being, for example, a Croat who is scared to come to Serbia due to being afraid of violence that is going to occur there, due to ethnic tensions, or being afraid that the police won't take any action because they're biased, because there are problems in the region. Our case and the things that proposition is standing for in this debate also include the victims. We also fight for them, and we also fight for their closure. Knowing this information and having this evidence will lead to an apology. This is something that we proved, but something also that is is coming is understanding. This leads to A, validation of the feelings of these victims. Now they see the criminal himself admitting that the thing that they did was wrong, but also B, they see that this person is apologizing. They see how he is feeling remorse. This means that they see him emotionally suffering for the actions that they took against their close member. Imagine being a mother whose child was killed brutally and you not knowing where this child is. You cannot even bury this child. His soul cannot ever rest until you have this information, until you have this closure. Two themes in this speech then. First of all, on effectiveness and retribution of victims, effectiveness of conviction, secondly on victims, and third on the aftermath of all of this. First of all, on effectiveness, a push that the opposition is trying to make is, oh, we made only 161 convictions, but you made 0. This is a straw man, dear panel, because the thing that we're trying to argue for is that convictions are not the way, truth is the way. Notice, and why is this important? Us finding who the criminals are, even without convicting them, is way more important because it comes to a precondition to any consequences happening. This means that you, before weighing as to whether or not the depth of the consequence is enough, we have to have a consequence and someone to punish first of all. This means that the analysis that is coming from proposition as to why we're able to convict more, to discover more criminals and to catch them is important simply because their case cannot stand without it, because we don't know who these people are. We are the only team acknowledging guilt in this debate. But also the problem with ICTY is that they're only catching 161 convictions to 60,000 deaths. You can see how the percentages are ridiculous, and this is not something that they can acknowledge. What are we pushing in this debate is A, due to different burden of proof, due to different amount of evidence, these institutions like the ICTY are slow and ineffective in catching these criminals. What responses do we hear from them? We hear that the burden of proof is the same. This is intuitively incorrect. For example, in our world, you get no investigation for getting a parking ticket, but you also will get investigated for first-degree murder. This means that the higher the consequence, the higher the investigation. On our side of the house, the judicial consequence is 0. But also, something that they're trying to argue for is that on our side of the house, because you're not convicted, you get no consequences. This is incorrect, dear panel. Yeah, after you admit guilt, you will get extremely delegitimized. Why is this the case? Because the people that support you are the people who are going to listen to you and only you, not the court. Because they're so radicalized that you're a war hero. This means that when they hear you say that you're guilty, that they will turn against you, because heroes don't do immoral things, because heroes don't murder people brutally for no reason, but also because evidence of these people's tombs are constantly brought up every time you're trying to, for example, backtrack on your apology, even after our framing that was never engaged as to why these people cannot backtrack their apologies and have to fill certain criteria in order to be eligible for amnesty. Okay, second of all, on victims. Why do we believe that victims are better retributed on our side of the house? Notice, why is jail not enough? One, you as the victim, you don't feel the person suffering as much, and you don't feel the positive that much. Why? This person is rotting in jail. You're far away from him. You don't have much information as to what is happening for him. He can be let go. He could be approached. You don't know. But on our side of the house, what you get is the mindset that you know what is happening to your child. You don't have to constantly sit there and wonder where is he, what happened to him later on, please. Which gives you peace of mind, which affects you to a much deeper level because it's in your mind. These are internal impacts that you have to live with every single day and that you see constantly. But also notice you'll probably be summoned in the TRC in order for this person to apologize to you. This is face-to-face contact, which means that again you're better impacted by the means on proposition. Second point of weighing. Notice, their arguments on retribution are dependent on the individual victim's understanding of morality. Notice, some victims may want this person to die. Some victims may want nothing to happen to them because people have different beliefs as to what is moral and what these people deserve due to fate, due to different reasons. This means that their case is only true into a certain amount of cases. On the flip side though, we are 100% sure that the only way to get this closure on our side of the house is for these people to confess simply because we prove to why they have no incentive and no way of finding out this evidence otherwise in court, because they will never say it because it will lead to a higher conviction. But okay, 3 in a bit, you will be retributed anyways because these people will be delegitimized even on our side of the house. Again, on the flip side, you will never get closure. And lastly, notice the amount of victims that we are able to retrieve is much higher than their amount of victims because we catch more criminals. This means that even if the retribution is like unfairly more on their side of the house, notice how we are able to help more victims, which means that again we are able to in the end of the day get higher retribution. POI.
In order to win truth versus justice, you needed to prove why truth isn't symmetrical and why the vast majority would be okay with having only truth and no due process.
Okay, actually this came in the first speech. These people, these criminals cannot lie. Why? Because we can chase this information. If you say that the body is buried in place X, you just check place X and see if there are bodies. If the information that person A and person B are giving are contradictory, you just have to figure out who is right by interrogating more people. And if you don't find out that they're telling 100% the truth, you just won't give them amnesty. This is our framing that you never engaged with. But okay, they say people just won't believe the TRC. No. First of all, notice how political parties have no incentive to discredit this TRC because then they look guilty themselves, because people trust these institutions deeply because they're independent and because they haven't failed them in the past, like the church, for example, because they're not political putting into perspective, like political parties who are obviously biased. But also victims will always listen no matter the rep of this institution simply because they want to know, and again, they will find out eventually. So dear panel, we believe that if you want these victims to be retributed, if you believe that catching 70% of the war criminals in Yugoslavia is something important to you, you should vote for proposition. But also, something that opposition never engaged with is our argument on tensions in the region. This is an argument that affects the entirety of the population on the Balkans because the everyday person is experiencing the negatives. For example, fear of going somewhere or violence happening and attacks and such things. This means that this argument impacts the entirety of the population, not just the victims who are 60,000 but still not that much comparatively. So if you believe the most important thing in this debate is to live in a country, in an area that is safe for you and that is able to provide you with some information and closure, vote for
Alright, thank you. Third proposition speaker, that was your remarks. Closes the remarks of the debate. Here.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Reconciliation, rehabilitation, and peace of the Balkan regions and former Yugoslavia is the goal of this debate. We both agree on that. But they tell us the ICTY is biased, and they tell you that truth, stories, and apologies are enough for catharsis. We tell you that the TRC would have been at least as biased or simply ineffective. We tell you that justice is the only way you're able to get catharsis. On that note, 3 issues. First, where you are able to get better catharsis. Is it through truth or justice? Second, in terms of the level of access to information you're able to get. And lastly, in terms of the importance of convictions and prosecution. So, addressing your points one by one, integrated responses. First, they tell us the ICTY is biased, but we tell you that it's probably far worse on crop. Why? If you do not rely on the United Nations, first, they never prove to us the capacity of third parties to necessarily be able to effectively act as a TRC. Where's the money coming from? Where's the funding coming from? Where are the people coming from? All unclear from their end. Not to mention, they never really tell us why these third parties are likely to be unbiased in the first place. Like, I find it very unlikely that they're going to be completely unbiased third parties. But then, if you do rely on the United Nations, then we tell you at best it is symmetrical because any bias that the ICTY would have, then the TRC would also have the same biases if it relied on the UN or NATO on their end. But to begin with, it is unclear what this bias even looks like when they fail to tell us what it even is. The only thing they tell us is, oh, they prosecuted Serbs and Bosnians more than other ethnicities, but it actually reflects what actually happened during the Yugoslav wars because the Serbian or the Bosnian Serb army was responsible for a lot of the crimes committed within the former Yugoslavia because they were trying to keep the entire nation together against the will of all the other nations involved. So this probably actually reflected the truth of the conflict, and we don't think this is actually a form of bias. But then, second, it is unclear why the truth necessarily leads to catharsis. And catharsis is important insofar as reconciliation can only occur once the need for justice is satisfied. More on that later. But it is unclear how this happens because they simply tell us, oh, truth equals I'm going to be relieved. But simply telling me how my child died is not going to make it up to me. If it is true, if the truth was enough, families would not pursue legal actions against people they already know killed their loved ones. Justice, prosecution, and the due process is a very important part of catharsis. Before I move on, I'll take that PY.
In 70% of cases where there is no recognition of this person being guilty whatsoever, the consequence is zero.
Okay, so I'd like to point out that we already tell you from both Kim and Mika that convictions are not the end goal. Prosecution is, due process is. The very fact that the criminals that killed your family or responsible for killing your family have to go up on a stage, have to respond to lawyers questioning them, have to face scrutiny, have to face the public is where you're actually able to feel catharsis. Because really, if you're telling us that the truth is the way you're able to get catharsis, we get it on our end as well. The Yugoslav war was covered by international media, and we already tell you, coming from Kim, our first speaker, that the ICTY also had a very thorough investigative body, because you cannot have cases without information on the war. You tell us as well that, we double check the information on the TRC because criminals cannot lie, we'll just dig up graves or what. But if you can confirm this information in the first place without asking criminals, without giving them amnesty, then why even ask them in the first place? Because the ICTY, in the same respect, was able to gather information just as effectively. We tell you that as soon as proposition fails to prove their burden as to how truth leads to catharsis, they already lose this debate. But then, second, they tell us, they're able to burst echo chambers by telling people the truth. But necessarily, the truth doesn't matter if you're angry. The truth does not matter if you're angry, and this is the same reason why misinformation prevails today in light of the truth. Because people want to hear things that validate them. They want to hear facts and stories that validate their emotions. And insofar as you push a narrative that doesn't necessarily respond to their emotions, they are unlikely to buy this. So even if you're trying to burst echo chambers, it is unlikely or unclear how that happens on proposition. But then they tell us, there's a low conviction rate, so how you're able to get catharsis. But first, I'd like to point out, even if only a few people were convicted by the ICTY, the point is, the ICTY handled representative cases. These cases represented the highest top officials who were responsible for the majority of the war crimes committed in the Yugoslav wars. These were the criminals that represented a lot of the war crimes that were going on. So through watching these trials, through observing the trials, through participating in them, victims were able to get catharsis through the few people that were convicted. And we tell you this is probably better than the world where you can just tell stories and get off scot-free. No. But then we tell you that empty apologies from politicians will not bring your family back. So ultimately, we think that conviction and prosecution is the only way forward. But in terms of access to information, we tell you that the ICTY would probably actually have been more thorough with the way they are gathering information. Because they tell us, coming from proposition, there's an incentive not to tell the truth or the full truth if you're in court. But we tell you that the TRC, historically, does not even cross-examine the people that they interview. And if you are delegitimized, if there is a consequence to telling the truth, then there's even less reason to give accurate information. So it is unclear to me why they're able to get better truth when you still have independent investigative bodies that don't need to interview people under the ICTY, under our will. So we think, at best, truth is a wash, probably is better on our end, but at the same time, they fail to prove to us how they are able to get justice. Because when we already tell you, coming from all of our speakers, that local courts are likely to be ineffective insofar as there's a bias to prosecute against criminals that hurt their country, or to give amnesty to criminals that did support their country, insofar as there's limited resources, insofar as it's a post-conflict state, and there's likely to be a lot of corruption, it is unclear how catharsis is likely to occur. So we tell you, first, the ICTY is likely to be less biased than the TRC, or at the very least, it has better funding. And second, we tell you that you're better able to get catharsis through justice, which you're only able to get on our end. But even if the ICTY was not perfect, the TRC would have been even worse. Why? Because we tell you that insofar as you aren't able to get catharsis through truth, this hatred, the lingering hatred that would have remained if this anger was not addressed, if there were no prosecutions, if you saw these war criminals have literally no consequences for their actions because they are given amnesty, this same hatred is what caused the conflicts that exist in the present day within Yugoslavia in the first place. This hatred is utilized by opportunist nationalistic politicians to win elections and create deep ethnic divides simultaneously. And they may say that ICTY was bad, but the TRC would have been even worse insofar as A, there was no bite to the policies of the TRC. So even if they say that, oh, truth is not the main thing that the TRC gives, but reconciliation or maybe like rehabilitative policies, the TRC historically has had no mandate to actually implement these policies. Like in Canada, the TRC, out of the 96 or so policies they passed, only 9 have even been implemented in the past 30 years. So it's unclear how they're able to get actual action on their end. It is unclear how the truth is able to give people what they want. We already tell you why that's unlikely to happen. We tell you why prosecution is the only way you're able to get catharsis insofar as there are consequences for the person that hurt you or the people that hurt you, insofar as it is representative justice through the ICTY that would probably not have existed on their end. We think that it is far clearer that you're able to get catharsis on our end, and therefore the prerequisite of reconciliation and peace in the former Yugoslav regions. For all of these reasons, I'm incredibly proud to oppose. Thank you.
Starting in 3, 2, 1, go.
It is unjust to deny someone the right to due process. I do not care if there's no guarantee you can convict this person. They needed action in order to rebalance the abuses they experienced, the amount of atrocities that they saw with their own eyes. There are a few problems on proposition bench. Firstly, the responses to our case are symmetrical. They can only say that the truth and information will allow victims to heal, and somehow these victims are going to forgive these perpetrators. We already claimed, especially from Kim, that information will happen on either side of the bench, and it's probably going to happen better on our side because we already said that you're literally convicting another person. You needed to be meticulous, even if it took time. You needed it to be meticulous in order to have a cohesive account of or a cohesive understanding of what happened during this war. But secondly, their entire case is contingent on this information being good, and they conceded at first that it will be less comprehensive than the ICTY because the TRC takes like less time than the ICTY. They didn't want to have this sort of time lag. So what this means is that one, we already explained they're probably not going to go through all the evidence like Kim mentioned. It's probably not going to be as meticulous as the ICTY. But secondly, is that what we said at DEP as well, is that they're not going to give out all the information. They're going to withhold it because there is no judicial jurisdiction on their end. There are two ways you should weigh this debate then. Firstly, on the value of truth without justice, but secondly, on solvency after the war has happened. Firstly, on the value of truth without justice, this is where a lot of their case is contingent on. They say knowledge is important. We already told you knowledge happens on either side of the bench. But other than that, the difference is that on their side, the TRC does not allow victims to avenge themselves. It doesn't allow victims to speak out against the abuses. It only allows them to release these types of reports or release information, right? But imagine you are like lost your like husband on the front lines. Your child witnessed the massacre of their entire town. You probably want to have a chance, at the very least, a chance to do something, regardless of the consequences. These people who go on the stand, they don't care about the amount of pressure they're going to feel after. All they want is a chance to see these people convicted. Even if that doesn't happen, they wanted to go through the process because the comparative then is informal justice. These people who are experiencing these high levels of emotion, who can never move on, are going to engage in microaggressions. If it is true that this already happens in status quo, if this is true, it already happens in status quo, it is going to happen on their end to a larger extent because you lack the option of a judicial due process through the ICTY. All you had was the TRC. it was ineffective. But lastly, on solvency, we already told you that at the very least, like we already told you that grief sticks, hatred is going to linger. If you couldn't fully forgive them with the ICTY, why are you going to forgive them with the TRC if they're simply releasing reports? What Kim mentioned as well is that at the very least, we were able to rebuild from the ground up because the ICTY set a precedent that no crime should go unpunished, that no stone should be left unturned, that we should hold all of these people accountable because of the things they did to the people on the ground, right? This was the reason why we were able to rebuild the systems in the first place. Even if these local systems aren't perfect, even if the international system isn't perfect, at the very least, we have the opportunity to go to court as opposed to forcing these individuals to just read a report and telling them, hey, this report is out, this is the timeline of the events, forgive the person who hurt you. I would never forgive the person who killed my mother within this war, right? You cannot expect someone to do that. At the very least, we're able to give them some sort of catharsis. They're able to go up on that stand and tell you that, hey, we should hold this person accountable. I don't care how long it takes. I do not care if you do not get the conviction. What they needed was the process of it in order to have some sort of solvency, in order to have some sort of peace. You get none of that on proposition. What they had to prove was why exactly justice was irrelevant. They had to explain why justice was irrelevant. At the very least, we were able to convict 161 prominent leaders of the wars, as opposed to on their end, you get 0. For all these reasons and more, opposition.
We thank the opposition reply speaker. Close the debate now. Opposition reply speaker.
Okay. Starting on my next one. I really do get the emotional part of this case. All of the things that happened are horrible, but when we do debates, we must look at the positive case, at the structural analysis and rebuttal on which we definitely win. Here is what happened in this debate. Let's begin with the victims, which is the thing they push the most. I gave a rebuttal in second speech that was never responded throughout their 3 debates. Please notice, we explain why this does not matter, because you as a victim always will feel like you could have gotten more, while with us you know you have gotten all you had. This is never responded to in their speeches. They need to respond to this. Why? Because if they never respond to this, then this argument doesn't stay. Because microaggression happened once again, because you're still mad, you still do microaggression, you're still incredibly sad that your children died. Why? Because you believe you didn't get enough. So at the point which I give this rebuttal, the only positive case they bring, which is victims, they don't bring any other positive case. This debate doesn't stand. We have some positive case, we win the debate. Simple as that. Great. But also, let's look at what they say on truth, because I believe this is also, once again, kind of strawmanish. They say we also get a lot of evidence. But in our first speech, you give a lot of reasons why you don't get as much evidence. I can repeat some of them, it's fine. No, this is not the case. You can get a verdict without finding a body, for instance, but by somebody snitching. With us, we know all the information. With you, you know only a bit of the information, which leaves victims even more paralyzed, because, for instance, they know when their children died, but they don't know when they died, where they died, all this sort of stuff. We get all the info, you get some of the info, which makes the victims think about it even more, remember this even more, feel even more horrible in this sort of particular way. Right. Then, what else? Yes, the info is not accessible. Once again, first speech framing. The info is not accessible to the average victim with you. Why? They were made in English. The language is very complicated because this sort of particular, because this court was from NATO, this court is in English. But secondly, evidence is very confidential. This is thing that you most probably cannot share very publicly, right? But thirdly, it uses complicated vocabulary, right? This is something the average Serbian person will most probably not understand. Came in first speech. Okay, let's continue to the most important point in this debate, which is nationalism. Right, we give 6 reasons why nationalism will increase. We say the court and decisions are viewed as biased. We say that you view them as done by bad actors. We say they took too long time. We say people were getting pardoned and you believe this is not fair. We say they give less sentences. We say all of these things. The only response we get is in third speech, where they basically say they have other reasons for them to do nationalistic things. But like, no, we believe this is not the case. Why is this the reason? Because because you view this person as the war hero. You view this person as the ones who started your nationalism, as the one who spread the propaganda that should be nationalistic. When he stays up and says, I apologize for this, I did something wrong, you're likely to think, this person is my hero, I looked up to this person, I'm going to most probably decide to not, I'm most probably going to not do nationalistic things anymore because he told me to, because I look up to him, because he's my role model as a Serbian person. Right. At the point that this is the case, this rebuttal doesn't work. And this is the most important crash point. Why? Because it affects more people in a more unique way than the victim crash point. Why? Because this looks like discrimination on the best case. Feeling unsafe in the country or in that you're constantly going to get attacked by some sort of minorities, not getting hired because you're some part of the minorities, and this impacts every single person from this ethnicity. And yes, all that happened to the victims is incredibly sad, and we are very forgetful, and we are very forgetful about this. But what is important is that the people who suffer from nationalism are more than 60,000 from 25 years ago up to now and up to the future.